Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Calculating Carbon on Recipes webinar. I appreciate you all joining us on this morning. Thank you so much for taking up your time. There is people still joining as I'm talking, so we'll start the actual presentation in a couple of minutes. But we are going to take up no more than an hour of your time today. We've got a very informal format, got some great guests that I'll introduce you to in a minute. And yeah, really exciting to understand more about this subject, how it can benefit us now and in the future, be it businesses in all different sectors of the food industries that we work in. So you actually see I am joined by two people at the moment, Matthew and Emily. We are hoping that Deborah is going to come back on. She has been online and is now experiencing some technical issues. But first of all, let me introduce the two guests that we have, and then hopefully Deborah will join us. So Carla, please, first, can you introduce yourself and welcome?
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be joining you this morning. My name is Carla Mackenzie, and I'm Managing Director of MYA Consulting. And I'm very much looking forward to this webinar. I would say up front, please forgive me, the room pre-booked at Heathrow this morning has found itself unable to be opened. So I speak to you today from the back of my motorcycle, but delighted to be here.
I think you get a special award for that, Emily, just for the ingenuity of managing to get. Sorry, I'm calling you Emily because that's what I've seen this week, Carla. So thank you for making it, and thank you from the we'll definitely get a picture and a post of where you are because it's just amazing to see the bike there as well. Matthew, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Sarah, and great to be with you all today. I'm Matt. I'm one of the co-founders of My Emissions, and we're a company that specializes in working with food companies to measure and calculate their carbon footprint from foods and to help reduce their impact and also to carbon label their individual products, meals and recipes. I'm sure you'll hear a lot more from me, so I won't go into too much detail other than we've also partnered with Kafoodle to kind of bring the carbon labeling offer to the platform. So really excited to speak with you all today to share more insights and to share more.
Thank you, Matt. And obviously, my name's Sarah. I'm the Operations Director of Kafoodle. We're hosting the session today. And at the end, I'll tell you a little bit more about us. And when we talk about Matt, we can show you the labeling that we've done. But it's not really about us today. It's more about the actual behind the scenes, what it is, why we're doing it, etc. And as the topics that we've covered already. Now, Deborah hasn't managed to join us yet. So I think we will make a start without her. I know Liz, my colleague, is behind the scenes, so she's helping to get Deborah on as well. And also, we're going to monitor your questions. So there's a Q&A panel that you all should be able to see. Pop your questions down. I've got quite a few questions already to ask the panel, but happy for you to start posting them in there now or as we go along. So I'm going to start by asking Matthew and Emily some questions, get a bit of dialogue, and then we'll go to the questions that you're posting. All right, so please keep them coming, however big or small. And then Liz will help me get through them and make sure that we get all your questions answered. Okay. So what we're going to cover today, quite a few different things. So first of all, the basics. So how can we measure carbon of recipes and menus? How do we do it? And why is it becoming important? What information consumers and customers are expecting on food carbon calculations? How businesses are building this into their sustainability programs, if they are already, what they're doing now, and is there a cost reduction or a profitability improvement to be gained from serving lower carbon meals and showing the calculation? All right, so lots to get through. Okay, so let's start with some basic then. So Matthew, please tell us, what is carbon labelling and why is it becoming so important to us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. So carbon labeling, I guess, is the closest parallel is calorie labeling or nutritional labeling. It's looking at the carbon footprint of individual meals, products or recipes measuring their carbon footprint and potentially other environmental impacts that it has, and then being able to display this to consumers. So lots of different ways that you can display this, whether as a number, whether as a rating system, and potentially there's a few other routes in between, but those are the two core ones that that I know we suggest, and that those are the ones that are becoming, I guess, most popular from what we're seeing across the market and across the sector. So it's being able to put an A to E rating on next to different meals or offerings based on its carbon footprint, or being able to say the total greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted as a result of preparing and making that food. And I guess the reason it's becoming so important is, as we're seeing, sustainability is generally becoming a really important trend. And food is responsible for at least 25%, if not more, of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So it represents one of the best and easiest ways for us to reduce our impact on the planet. And at the moment, there's no real communication to consumers on how and why they should reduce their carbon footprint from food. And I guess carbon labeling is a really great way of achieving that.
Yep, no, that makes sense. But you mentioned there's a couple of different ways. So is there no standard at the moment?
There's not a standard per se at the moment. It's still an emerging and a new area. And I guess what a lot of regulators are looking for is more evidence, more proof, more examples and case studies before they kind of require and regulate a single version or standard. So we're a little bit earlier than we are on, say, nutritional labeling or calorie labeling. But I guess what's really exciting for us is we're now seeing more and more regulators, so DEFRA, the FSA, starting to look into carbon labeling and general environmental labeling. And so we do expect a standard to become apparent in the next few years, and we're really excited for that, because I think that will really help the kind of the sector and the industry.
Okay, I understand. And let's just talk about how it's calculated in a little bit more detail. So what's included? I'm just going to bring up a slide when you talk about this so that we can go through some of the areas. See that slide?
Yes, absolutely. So
Yes.
again, in the same way that the actual way that the labels look and feel aren't regulated at the moment, there is still an area of flexibility on exactly what is and isn't included. And this is a system boundary that we work with and work for all of our carbon labeling. So we focus on the farming, processing, packaging, and transport emissions of each meal or products that we assess, and that's what we use for our carbon label. It covers a majority of the food's carbon footprint, and it relies on data that is consistent and that is generally known and available to our customers. And sometimes we have to rely on secondary data. So, for example, if you don't know exactly where your foods are coming from, if you're not sure exactly how they've been processed, potentially, we have a lot of default values in our database, and those have all been generated based on academic papers. We always use papers from peer-reviewed journals in order to bring this data in. But then we also supplement it with more primary data. So if we know exactly what packaging is used, if we know the transport routes, if we know the processing, so the energy that's made to manufacture the foods, potentially less relevant in food service, where that's a little less well known, but especially with the products that we work with, we do go into a lot more detail and use more primary data where we can. So there's that mix of primary and secondary data, which is a good way of making it a little bit more accessible to bring these values through. And yeah, we start at that. We focus on that earlier stage of the system boundary, which covers essentially the carbon footprint of the ingredients for when they reach the kitchen and when they reach the store.
Okay, so how much in percentage wise is the stuff up to the green arrow?
It obviously varies food on food, but generally we see 60 to 70% of a food's carbon footprint from those earlier stages. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but that's a general rule.
Okay, thank you for that. What I'll do now then is just show you how we show this on our software within Kafoodle. So what we do is we have a direct link with Matt, as we said earlier, with My Emissions. So every recipe now you can see the allergens, nutrition, and then the rating. So from the ingredients and a couple of other questions, as Matt mentioned, we send over packaging information and how the actual item is going to be delivered or served. We get a rating. A to E is kind of traffic light, very easy to understand. So green, obviously good, red, not so good. And then you can see at the bottom, we have the emissions total per recipe and serving. Okay, so that is it. It's really, really simple. That's what we're kind of showing, as in how we actually show the label. I'm just going to stop sharing now. So Matt, what type of businesses are already doing this? So what kind of businesses do you work with at the moment?
There's a whole range of companies that are looking into this, from retailers, individual products, restaurants, and caterers. So we saw last year at the COP26 summit that the whole meals and menus were carbon labeled. So they had a low, medium, and high, and a total number next to each menu item that was available. And we're starting to see more and more sites across both contract catering and restaurants adopting this service. We ourselves work with a number of them. We're also seeing it within the products and the retail space. So recently, retailers have sort of been piloting and coming together to try and bring a harmonized label across food products, and that's something we're hoping to see in the next few months, which will be a really exciting opportunity across the space to see a more consistent system. There's a lot of complexity trying to come up with like a single system. It's not an easy thing to do, but the exciting thing is with more and more companies adopting this and introducing this, and more, I guess, as sustainability becomes more important, all that's going to mean is there's a bigger need for kind of standards and regulation, and we're going to see more and more companies adopting it, which is going to, hopefully we would see companies starting to display and carbon labels far more regularly, and consumers then being able to make a much more informed choice.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So Carla, then obviously what Matthew's told us is going to help our clients choose, make better choices or make their own choices, and obviously help the chefs as well, I guess, with their menu planning and what they want to put on their menus. Would you say that is the only way that we can reduce food carbon within businesses?
Hello. I think if you look at the bigger picture, it's about a third of the world's food production that goes to waste. I think what I would be saying, both as an operator and as someone who's looked at this industry of ours go through the most horrendous 2 years of pandemic care in hospitals or in schools, lockdown and lockout, or in restaurants, closures. And on top of that, we got the pleasure of implementing Natasha's Law recently, and now we're facing into measuring our carbon footprint. I think as an operator, what one has to appreciate is, and I'm so sorry if somebody's revving up in the background, is that it's coming at us whether we like it or not. And if we can be early adopters and start to put the education and the process into our kitchens now, it will be an awful lot easier when it becomes, as it will do, mandatory. I think there's a big piece of education for our kitchen teams. Many of our kitchen teams went into catering because they love the soul of food. They love the creativity of the industry. And they tended to do it because it's a very practical industry. And we're now seeing that very practical industry in an ever-increasing compliant framework. And we will need to look at how we educate and how we take teams through that journey.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's just, it's calories we've just gone through, which is additional cost, additional effort. Time is not anyone's side at the moment. Labour shortages are what they are. So, now I'm thinking, well, really, do I need to do this? But a lot of industries, yes, is the answer, because tenders are already asking for it. So if you're in public sector, then you probably have to be doing it already. That includes a lot of contract caterers now, not just healthcare and education. So it is already affecting a lot of businesses.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important that everybody gets on board, small, medium and large organisations, because what we've seen through the calorie labelling journey is that many small suppliers, for example, struggled to be compliant, and therefore larger buyers had no option but to go elsewhere for their product. So there's a deeper impact on both the rural and small business economy. Because of that, that also affects the carbon footprint. So, we need as an industry to come together and to work collaboratively for the best outcomes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's soul destroying that local suppliers can't supply because of legislation. That's just ridiculous, isn't it? And you mentioned waste there. So do you think there's so much more opportunity on waste from where you clients that you work with and what you've seen? Is waste still an issue, or is everyone tackling it now?
I think waste is still an issue, and there's lots of energy being put in to reduce waste. As we go into tighter economic times, focusing on that reduction of waste, looking at strategies for not creating the waste in the first place, or using whole ingredients, or pre-ordering, or whatever your sector is. Because I'm aware today I'm sat in front of people from healthcare that often can't predict patient volumes.
Yeah.
People from restaurants who are probably offsetting by giving to charity. People from schools who are working to people whose core activity is not necessarily food. So there's a bigger piece here that says it has to be about everybody's personal responsibility, in the same way that food safety is about everybody's personal responsibility. We have this is a sort of perhaps a bit evangelical, but we have an absolute duty as a community of hospitality professionals to do our very best to get that carbon emissions number down. And I think by creating a Where Am I Now audit, so auditing your current footprint and seeing where you are in terms of a net zero journey, and then starting to put strategies in place to see teams through that will mean that you've got a bit more time in the window to do it. Also that we actually end up getting where we need to get and preserving the very essence of what keeps us all here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. I think Deborah's joined us. Deborah, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me, Sarah?
Hear you really well. Hear you well. We're not going to see you, we're just going to hear you, but that's fine, yeah?
I don't think you want my flashing camera, so I'll just go with audio.
No problem. Could you introduce yourself to the audience, please, Deborah?
Yes, hello everyone. So I'm Deborah Adams from Arena for Finance, and we're a training consultancy. So we work with lots of hospitality businesses, providing courses and resources for understanding the accounts, so the management accounts. And one of our most popular courses is food cost control, and looking at how to manage gross profit through to net operating profit. And obviously in the last couple of years, there's been a huge number of challenges, but most recently the challenge of food inflation.
Thank you. So I'll hit you straight with a question then. So do you think there's a correlation then between offering low carbon meal choices? Can it reduce a business's food cost?
Well, I think as Carla said, and Carla's made lots of great points there, that it's complicated, isn't it? So there isn't that direct correlation. But what we do know is that food inflation is running probably at a higher level than the general rate of inflation. So we've been used to 2% inflation as our overarching inflation for many years. Now we're at 9% going up to 10, maybe up to 11% forecasted by the autumn. But our food operators will know that many food items are running at a much higher inflation percentage. And so gone are the days of costing your menus on your standard recipes and then thinking, well, that's that job done for a while. You've got to actually keep on constantly monitoring the cost of the food on the plate and keeping that information up to date. And of course, many food products have increased because of the increasing cost of energy and the increasing cost of the feed for those products. And so clearly the cost of meat-based products have increased at a very high rate, and some plant-based products as well. But today you're discussing the carbon emissions and comparison between meat-based products and plant-based products, and obviously introducing more plant-based products into your menu design is going to help with food cost control. But again, it's not entirely as simple as that, because you've got to look at where do those products come from, the food miles involved, the production process, and so on. But we always say the more that you gain insight into these different elements, then the greater control you're going to have over your business. So yes, but with some reservations. It's complicated.
Yes, but no, but I think you're right. I think education is the key, isn't it? If you know what your dishes are costing and you keep them up to date, if you know the carbon values, then it's there to see, isn't it? It's very clear to see, and it's offering that choice as well. What about though consumer behaviour? How do we, in all the different sectors that we're speaking to today, how do we improve food seasonality? So reducing, improving seasonality on menus and not expecting to have off-season fruit on the menu, etc. I'll ask Carla that one, if you had to work on that one. I mean, how do the schools do it? Do they do it?
I think there has been a general trend certainly across the contract catering sector, to introduce seasonal products, to be conscious of of cooking and preparing with British seasonal produce. I think there's been a big step towards that. We're also seeing the trend in our Michelin star restaurants, and we may see less so in what I call the static larger brands, but I think coming to us in the future is again a return perhaps to the traditional eating of strawberries in the summer and Brussels in the winter. So I think it is coming to us, but remember that we've got to take a whole series of generations of people who have grown used to a global palette of ingredients. Indeed, their expectation when they're going into restaurants is that they'll have access to that global palette of ingredients. Farming methods change in the UK, and they will. And we get more instances of vertical farming and those kind of solutions that will allow us to spread the ingredient palette again. It's not a simple answer, and I know that there'll be many people sitting and saying, well, I still have to get X product to satisfy X need. Also an issue about being realistic. There was a situation where a very large event organisation specified organic eggs. Britain didn't have the production yield of organic eggs to be able to supply that need. It has to work in context with DEFRA. It has to work in a harmonious and joined up way. And it really ought to be working with our national food programmes.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I hear you. And it is something like you say, my teenage kids, they're all up for reducing their carbon footprint. They're so well informed. But people of an older generation, how do we educate them? Or are we going to get to them? Or are we just going to start and work down?
Well, I think if you took my mother's generation straight out of World War II, I think you'd find them very much more make, do and mend, knowing how to preserve, not wasting anything. So we do have leadership generations in our country that find waste today very difficult and find our consumerist-led society quite challenging because of their background. So I think we've probably got it at the top and we've probably got it at the bottom.
Yeah.
And it's this piece in between that we need to work with. I just wanted to pick up on just a small point as well, that it is going to be ever so important, particularly in the highly influenced generations, our teenagers, very careful about carbon footprint and nutritional intake and putting some solid education in behind that. Also say that to our hospital teams as well. You know, remember, we still need to get the repairing vitamins and proteins in. We still need to make sure those dishes are properly constructed. It's a complex subject.
Yeah,
And
it really is.
It
Yeah.
will take a lot more debate, I think.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Because Matt, there is talk now about a more generic score, isn't there, which would consider nutrition and carbon and other factors as well.
There is. It's certainly still early days, but looking into different options and how we could maybe try and bring the two together. I think regardless, Carl, it's a great point that we should be trying to, you know, looking for foods that are both sustainable and nutritious, and I guess promoting a balanced diet. I know certainly we try, and one of the big things we say is we're not trying to tell everyone they need to necessarily go vegan or vegetarian. That's not what we're trying to do in our labeling. It's about making informed choices and promoting people to make small choices every day. And if we can just move some food options, some dinner choices to be more sustainable, then that's a great win. And starting small and building up from there. And that way there can then be a balance between that sustainable and nutrition. So it's certainly something we want to see. And I think definitely over the next few months and years we'll see a lot more of it. And I'm certainly interested how it will interplay with, say, something like calorie labeling, for example, where that's now on menus. And I know calorie labeling is only one form and one point of nutrition, but hypothetically, what happens in 2 or 3 years' time if we want to incorporate some form of environmental labeling? Is that carbon labeling? And is there a carbon number next to a calorie number? Is that going to lead to too much space and too much noise on a menu? And what does that look like? These are actually quite complicated questions when you start to think about how operationally they could or couldn't work. So I'm certainly excited to see where it goes, but I think there's still lots of things to move out. And I guess it comes back to that some of the points we said at the start, which is that the more people are adopting it, the more we're using it, as we're seeing is happening, the more evidence we'll have, the more case studies we'll have, and that's only going to make things even more powerful and exciting.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Sorry, it's Liz here. It's actually quite a good time if the questions come through. So do carbon labels actually change consumer behavior, i.e. do they actually choose lower carbon meals? So my guess would be, Matt, you might be closer to sit on this one to come back with an answer.
Absolutely. And the simple answer is we're measuring it. There are studies that have been completed which suggest that they do. I wouldn't say necessarily they've been comprehensive enough to be conclusive that, yeah, absolutely, this is happening. But the early signs are that they do make an impact. They've been measured and tested in retail settings. They've been tested in food service settings. I know Compass Group have been doing a lot of work on this to try and measure the impacts. And there's been a lot of academic papers that have been published off the back of those insights, which suggest that that there is positive behavior change. We're currently going through, so 2 of our clients in particular, Camille Tai and the University of Massachusetts, actually in the US, we're currently reviewing a lot of their purchases over the last few months to see if we can spot any trends. But again, that's only a 3 to 4 month period. So it's still early-ish. Actually, one thing I think that's really important to bring up is that carbon labeling and has many benefits, not just helping consumers to make more choices. Actually, what we have seen is it's really effective at helping businesses and companies to reduce the carbon footprint of their offering. The best example we have of that is our client Simply Lunch, who are sandwich providers, grab and go sandwich, paninis, wraps. They've actually removed all beef items from their menu. They found that there was only a few of them on their product list of 80 to 90 recipes, and they weren't necessarily the biggest sellers, and they had a significantly higher carbon footprint. And once they saw the data and just how big an impact their beef products had compared to their others, they actually decided to just delist them, and they focused on their other brands and their other products. So that's a really good and quite simple case study, which is again a trend that we're seeing, that actually the numbers and having the data, having the values, having the reports, the ratings, actually the biggest impact right now can potentially be within the companies themselves and helping you to reduce the carbon footprint of your businesses. And certainly then we would hope, and what we do with all of our clients is start to measure that, so you can actually see how much you've been able to reduce your carbon footprint over 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever that time scale looks like. But that's an additional benefit. So I think it's important, whilst we're talking about carbon labeling, measuring the carbon footprint of your products has many benefits, not just the consumer impact on label from the carbon label themselves.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, some good examples there for customers that you're already working with. And I know some of the schools that we've started working with on labelling are having, maybe using it to have low carbon days or weeks or themes, rather than just putting it on the menus every day and letting the pupils choose that way. So there's different ways, I think, like you say, of educating your people that are actually going to eat, or the people that are actually creating the menus and meals.
If I can, Sarah, I've just remembered one other output which we found really powerful is making comparisons, insights,
Yes.
and metrics. So one of our clients, as I mentioned, Camille Thai, restaurant chain, 40-ish sites across UK and Ireland, they've pushed out a graphic which shows that the difference between their tofu green curry and their beef green curry, the difference between those meals is, in carbon footprint terms, is more than a one-person trip on the Eurostar or on the train from London to Paris. So they've been able to push out a little graphic, a poster, which they've been able to put around, which helps to show not just, okay, this meal's an A, this meal's an E, but just how big an impact the difference between an A and an E can be. And again, that's not necessarily carbon labeling. It's more about a comparison. It's an insight. It's an infographic, I guess. But those as well are really, really powerful at helping to inspire change. And we've talked briefly about menu design and the space being a premium on menus. Actually, that's not the only way you need to use this data. And those infographics, which can be posters alongside a menu or at the side or on social media posts or anywhere else, can be really, really powerful at helping to kind of inspire those changes. And yeah, I guess exactly as you were saying, Sarah, once you know which items are lower carbon, you can help to push and nudge consumers towards those, and that can start shifting the carbon footprint of your outlets down quite significantly.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And one of our audience, Joe from NHS, has made a really good point, Carla, just agreeing with you on the malnutrition point, especially in hospitals, and how important it just can't be low carbon, it's got to be nutritious as well.
Absolutely, because, you know, in that context, food is the very best medicine that a patient can get. And a lot of illness is generated through poor nutrition. And for our hospitals, it's terribly important that they're able to support a well-being agenda. I was just reflecting when I was listening just then that one of the things that I have seen is when the calorie information got forced onto menus over the last months, the things it did do was make organisations look really carefully at what a 2,000 calorie burger read to the customer. And it did actually get a lot of organisations redeveloping their menus and their dishes and their offers to to a more, a more tolerant, reasonable calorie status. If we start the journey now with teams, and if we make it a visionary journey, we will get buy-in, and we will grow the knowledge of the teams that are implementing this.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Carla, we've mentioned obviously the carbon labelling calculations, we've mentioned waste and seasonality. But as a business, if I want to begin my net carbon journey, how do I start? Is it just about the food? What, very briefly, obviously, we've got a whole day. What do I need to do?
But I think that the best place to start is to start with an audit that looks at where you are in terms of a journey to net zero in your kitchen. Because going on quite a tough journey, you're going to have to take people with you, you're going to have to take suppliers with you, your consumer. It's really important that you know where you are now and you can measure that journey and celebrate the successes within that journey. And so often people say to me, actually, well, it's because we're a gas kitchen that we're less carbon efficient. Waste is greater in some of the audits we've done than the impact of gas. So understanding where the big opportunities are is important. I would say to you is set up a vision, make it one of the pillars of your operation, your organisation, your restaurant, your business, and highlight and find some champions within your business that you can create and nurture to start spreading the word. I think the industry scaling costs, given the pressures that we will all face in the next 18 months, whether we're working in a cost plus location or whether we're working in the high street profit and loss locations, you've got to get technology in. You've really got to use all the tools in the kit bag. This isn't something you want to be sat calculating manually. You're in food service and you're changing your menus every day and you're putting in excess of 40 and 50 different dishes out a week to be automated. It really does. I would say start with the audit, your steps. You're not going to do it all overnight. Automate where you practically can. Make it a pillar. We saw some amazing examples of the hospitality industry during COVID doing some absolutely brilliant work within our communities. No different, this is supporting the communities just in a different way. So make it part of that value set. And I also put on my notes when I was thinking this through, we saw so much work around food poverty and hunger during the last 2 years, and so many of our colleagues getting on board to support communities to help that. See a lot more of it, and it'll be really difficult for some of those communities to make a low carbon choice. They want some highly calorific, satisfying stuff just to deal with hunger. There's a bigger agenda in this, I guess is what I'm saying. And so think about when you plan your organisation, think about its contribution to all those agendas. Of course, above all, strong training and education within that. Just sort of answer it.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic answer. And Deborah, is it something that companies have to be looking at now as part of sustainability and CSR? Is it part of my company report? What actually legally needs to be done at the moment?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, and Carla's very correct to say, we need to be working on this now. So we've got various milestones. In the UK, 1st of April 2019, the government introduced streamlined energy and carbon reporting. So that means that companies listed on the stock exchange are already reporting on their carbon emissions and energy usage. So that's around about 12,000 companies. Then unquoted companies, and there's a criteria in terms of size, so balance sheet size and turnover and so on. They are also required to report. But at the moment, the focus is mainly on Scope 1 and Scope 2, which is energy usage. But Scope 3 is the big one. And as we move towards the global targets of net zero by 2050, but halving emissions by 2030, which is only 8 years away, there's going to be more and more focus on the reporting of the Scope 3 emissions, which is where the supplier aspect comes into the calculation.
Sorry to interrupt, Deborah, just for everyone's benefit, Scope 3 is, yeah, it's third party, isn't it?
Yeah, so Scope 1 and 2 focus on energy and fuel usage. Scope 3 focuses on your supply chain, things like staff travel and so on. But obviously for the hospitality industry, it's food and beverage purchases and supplies are a large part of that. So at the moment, the legislation is very much focused around the bigger business, and whereas in the UK, of course, small businesses make up the large proportion of business in the UK. But we do have overall that sort of global target that we're working towards. And the hospitality industry is an industry that the government could focus on in more depth, because it is an industry with quite a high carbon footprint. So we may well see, and I don't have any insight into this at the moment, but my guess is that we will see more pressures and targets coming towards the hospitality industry. But the industry itself is already aware of that and is doing a lot to move towards these milestones. And it's a really good idea to have a look at the UK Hospitality website, and they're working with the Zero Carbon Forum, and they've already got lots of materials and ideas around how to start to move yourself towards net zero. As I say, we're going to see more and more resources, I think, becoming available. And as Carla has said, technology is absolutely key. You can't sit there with paper and pencil and a calculator and try and do this. You've got to bring in the skills of the innovators in this area, which will include technology. And so our first milestone is 2030. And you can't obviously you can't wait till 2029 to start looking at that. You've got to be looking at it now and setting short-term milestones that will be manageable and take you towards that end game.
Yeah, it's really not that long away if you put it like that. Yeah, it is something that people should be looking at now, really, isn't it? Even a basic audit or something, so you know what is the journey and what needs to be done. Thank you. And we've spoken a little about different sectors, but Matt, from the customers that you're dealing with now, what sectors seem to have embraced it already, carbon calculations?
I definitely see it going quite wide at the moment within restaurants and catering. That seems to be a really popular area, and I guess a good reason for that is generally outlets have a range on their menus. So they have high carbon, but they also have low carbon, and it's a really good opportunity to kind of give consumers a choice. Let's say 20 menu items, but all of them can be carbon labeled. It's maybe harder for a product, or there's more nerves for a food product to put their label on their packaging if they're then going to go in a retail environment where they're the only ones with that carbon label. It's quite a leap of faith, whereas there's maybe a little bit more control in restaurant and catering. We're also seeing, and I know there's competition everywhere, but definitely helped by things like COP26. There's great case studies on how to adopt and implement carbon labeling. We're then seeing it being adopted more and more and copied across more events. We're doing an event next week all the way in Portugal and Lisbon, which is going to be really exciting, and to see it, I think, just to see it across. So now that we've maybe got more case studies, it's potentially a bit simpler to assess food service environments than products environments. We're seeing a big trend in that area, and we're seeing more and more implementing it and adopting it for sure.
So is it quite easy to calculate in different countries once you've got a basic idea? You can work in different countries, can you?
it takes a bit of, we need to assess where we can work and what the level of data is. I can see as well there's the questions of granularity of data and how detailed we can be, so I can answer that question now if that's helpful. But we have a database that's very well geared for UK. It's relatively good coverage across the EU, where we have values both generally in the EU and some values which are country specific in the EU. And we also have some values which are specific, whether foods are grown organically or not organically, or actually more relevantly, whether they're grown seasonally or not seasonally. So for example, tomatoes grown in a heated greenhouse versus tomatoes grown seasonally outdoors. There's a lot of data out there, and there's a lot of sources of data that we could use. I'm answering Jordan's question a little bit because I know I can see that you've referenced EcoInvent, which is one of our data sources. We try and take in data from as many of the different databases and papers and individual papers and studies as we can. We always verify that they're using a similar system boundary. There's a lot of work to do to make sure we can fairly assess studies and papers and values from two different authors and publishers. And the way we work is an element of pragmatism. So for example, the difference between I mean, actually, again, I'm kind of answering the next question as well, on my mind. Actually, the difference between organic meats and non-organic meats is not that large on a percentage basis. Sometimes organic food can actually have a higher carbon footprint than non-organic foods. But in the scale of the difference of, say, chicken versus pork versus non-organic and organic chicken, the differences in that second version, that the organic and non-organic chicken, aren't always as high as, say, the difference between going from chicken to pork. And the way that we've adopted and looked at our databases, we've tried to find some high-level data on where those differences and the biggest impacts will be. And that's where we focus our research. So, for example, that tomatoes example, the difference between seasonally grown tomatoes and tomatoes grown in a heated greenhouse can be tenfold. The tomatoes from a heated greenhouse can be higher carbon than some cheeses and some fish and other what you would normally class as high carbon ingredients. So where we see a big difference, that's where we focus our research, and then we're looking to go down kind of example and add more data and more research where it's going to make the biggest impact and difference. So we don't have complete coverage of all ingredients. We try and be as transparent and have as good a coverage as we can, but more often than not, we're able to utilize a value that is very representative, and it's going to, at least for displaying the A, B, C, D, E rating, or those high level numbers, we're going to have it good enough. Then I guess the final piece to round it off, obviously our research is partly influenced by our clients. So if, for example, we had one client with lots of, I don't know, pork, let's say pork or ham was a key ingredient for them, and they wanted to make a change or a swap between organic or not organic pork, or the difference between other bread options, veg options, seasonally grown options, we do a lot more analysis into those. I know, for example, we've worked with a couple of chocolate providers over the last few months, and we've done a lot of work studying and understanding what differences there are within chocolate and cocoa, and putting that and feeding that back into our database. So it's a constantly evolving process. It's a living document for sure. We and I think it's right that we do this, that we try and just be pragmatic. There's so much research we could do, so we try and do the research which is going to have the biggest impact on the final values and on the ratings that would then be displayed for consumers.
Thank you. That's really good. Without going into too much detail, I think you have kind of covered Jordan and Mark's questions there. And Sally's asked about the accuracy, and again, I think you've covered hers, because what you're saying, it's not to the nth degree. You're taking high level information, you're knowing where those key hitters and kind of factors are impacting food, and therefore applying to the rating.
I guess one very specific point on accuracy and the need to kind of give credible values is also the need to give values that are across the life cycle of a product. So it's becoming a bigger area in especially food products where we see the introduction of the Green Claims Code, and that is the legislation which has led to news articles about Innocent and about Oatly recently, where they've been, and actually Tesco even last week or the week before, where they've been I guess caught up by these claims, where they've made a claim but not been about the sustainability of their products. Maybe they've I think the Tesco example was they didn't have a life cycle assessment, or they didn't have a study which backed up their claims that their plant-based products had a lower carbon footprint than an equivalent meat product. Oatly, the reason they were caught by the claim was, or by the code, is they weren't specific enough about what comparisons they were making. And Innocent, there was a number of factors, but one of the factors was they claimed that because they have sustainable packaging, their product is sustainable, which is not necessarily true. You can't just say we've got sustainable packaging, which is only one part of the food's life cycle, like we saw from that graphic, and therefore you have a sustainable product. It needs to be backed up by a wider range and a wider coverage of the product's life cycle and carbon footprint. And so there's both the accuracy, but also having that confidence and looking across the value chain that those values are correct. And the way we work in terms of when we talk to clients about this is there's an element of how much primary data you can supply and that you want to supply. Obviously, the more primary data in terms of where your ingredients are coming from, what type of foods you're using, we can make the values then more specific. But there is a point where you've given sufficient that we can have relative confidence, especially on that A, B, C, D, E rating, that those bands are correct and that those claims are kind of reputable. And as I was saying, we have values that are UK specific for the majority of ingredients now, which is then, especially in that food service setting, where there is changing supply chains and you might not have great coverage of exactly where your foods are coming from, more than sufficient in order to start introducing at least some claims and some labeling.
Okay, thank you. And one of the questions that Joe's just asked now, and it's becoming very, very clear, it's education. Are there good, have you seen, the three of you, I'll open it up to all of you, have you seen good training courses, good e-training that's at the right level for our kitchen teams, for our meal planners? What is out there in the market at the moment that's affordable and easy to do? Does anyone know?
I think it's still an evolving area. As an organisation, we have a specialist consultant who's doing net zero audits, and from those net zero audits, then training can be written to target the key areas and to get into the root and branch. But maybe the person that's just written this question has identified a big gap in the market for this area. And I think the other thing I would just be, I didn't know whether Matt had any thoughts on, whether putting an inaccurate label on, or a label that doesn't absolutely nail the consumer's understanding of the carbon footprint could potentially represent a risk to a business. Wondered whether he might have a view on that.
Yeah, I think businesses need to do their kind of research and need to build up that confidence. I know, for example, we've talked about how there's not necessarily a standard for food carbon labeling, but there are established carbon accounting standards, like, for example, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And what we've done as a business is make sure that our methodology, all of our data is standardized, and that we do align with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And we've even worked with a consultant to kind of audit our calculation process and kind of verify that from a third party perspective. So we do a lot of work to make sure we can have confidence in what we're saying, and then hopefully that means that our clients can have confidence in the values. And I think, again, there's what we like about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is there's that level of pragmatism where, for example, I talked much earlier about that difference between primary and secondary data. And I guess in a food service environment, you naturally do end up using more secondary data because you have less kind of processing steps. You might have less control of your packaging or your transport as it gets to your stores. But what the Greenhouse Gas Protocol says is if something is scope 1 and 2, if it's well within your control, you should have good coverage of it. You should be using primary data. Where it's scope 3, there is an acceptance and an acknowledgement that you will need to use more secondary data. We think that's a very pragmatic approach, and right now we've had decades where carbon labeling hasn't really been talked about. The food's impact on the planet and on carbon emissions hasn't really been talked about. And I think the reason we're seeing such a big trend towards carbon labeling now is just because of how big an impact food has. And I'd say the risk of being a few 10, 15, 100 grams off on your assessments of carbon might be significantly outweighed by the benefits of at least starting to communicate that your food has a carbon footprint and has an impact on the planet. And this is a lot of the thinking that we do as a company. I'm more than happy to talk about this at far more length with all of you, I'm sure. But hopefully, Carla, I've started to answer your question there.
Can I just pick up on Joanna's question about education, and obviously that is absolutely key, and so it's something that we're working on in my company at the moment, is to develop short courses, both e-learning content and face-to-face as well, which is a natural extension from the courses that we currently offer in cost control. In terms of resources available at this moment, then WRAP is another useful resource as well. Lots of great material on their website. They're focused more on the wastage side, but there's a lot of great material for gaining additional insight into how you're using food products in your organisation.
Thank you, Deborah. Right, I'm going to wrap that up. There is a couple of questions that we haven't got to, so I'll make sure we get individual replies to you. But I just want to thank the panel so much. I do apologise to all of you for the technical, especially Deborah, that we can't see you. I'm sorry about that. And Carla, thank you again for sitting on your motorbike. Good luck with your flight. I hope now you don't have a horrendous time trying to get on the plane. Matthew, thank you so much for your time. I think it's been a fantastic hour session. We've brought a lot of content in. There's some real key takeaways from me. I think the biggest one that I'm going to take away is education and training. It's like everything, isn't it? That's where we have to start. And I think from Kafoodle's point of view, I'd love to just put some quick socials out once a week, maybe on about, like the tomatoes that Matthew mentioned, just some real easy wins that we can start getting people's into their heads. Like now I've started working on it. I know so much about the beef and pork and other bits and pieces. So it's just slowly well, not slowly, is it? If we can quickly educate some quick wins out there, I think that would help. And it would be really exciting to see Deborah's training materials once they're up and running. Thank you all. There'll be recordings. As I say, any questions, please do come back to me, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.